Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled, Where Do Cyber Risks and GDPR Compliance Meet? My name is Lucy Buckley, and I'm the online event coordinator here at ISACA. We have a great presentation in store for you today thanks to our sponsor, SecurityScorecard. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few quick tips. You have two audio options. One is to listen over your computer speakers. Two, you may dial in at any time using the numbers and codes listed to the left. Please note if you dial in, there might be a slight delay as the slides advance. All ISACA members can receive 1 CPE credit for viewing today's webinar. If you are watching this event live, you must complete 3 checkpoints. Simply click OK on the pop-ups that appear on your screen. If you're watching the on-demand recorded version of this event, your progress is being tracked. You must watch from the beginning to the very end. After completing the webinar, you can receive your CPE certificate by visiting the transcripts page within your My Learning portal. Please remember that it takes 24 hours for the CPE credit to appear in your ISACA profile. We've made a job aid that goes over these steps in more detail. Click on the Papers tab to learn more or to download a PDF of today's presentation. Our speaker will be conducting a Q&A session towards the end of this event, so if at any point you have a question, please click on the Q&A tab. If at any time you need technical support, please access the Help tab. Finally, if you have any questions about CPE submission process or suggestions regarding our webinar series, please visit support.isaca.org. And now, I'm very excited to be introducing our speaker for today, Fouad Khalil. Fouad is the head of compliance at SecurityScorecard and is responsible for internal and external compliance programs, auditor education, alignment with industry best practices, and global sales support. With extensive experience in technology space with more than 25 years spanning disciplines in software development, IT support, program and project management, and most recently, IT security and compliance management, his career path in technology has provided him with a keen insight in the areas of network, system, and database administration, software programming, system, software, and GUI design, project and product development, solution implementation, and much more. For nearly the past 2 decades, Fouad has focused on data security, security investigations, security training and awareness, and security compliance, serving as an industry expert in the key areas such as information technology, National Institute of Standard and Technology, internal control over financial reporting, and more. He holds a bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from Marquette University and a CISA certification. He's also an active member and contributor to ISACA. Now, let's get started. Fouad, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. And after that intro, I'm willing to hire myself. Thank you for that great intro. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen about GDPR, cyber risks, and some of the best practices that we can put on the table. Just a little bit of background. The agenda is going to focus on what GDPR brings to the table. What is really personal data? There's been a lot of discussions around what is personal data, how does it differ from what we know from the U.S. laws and legislations we have enacted, and so on. And I'm going to dive a little bit about that. Also, it's all about risk-based approach. GDPR is all about risk. Once you have a solid privacy program in place, and you have a risk-based approach to addressing risk to your organization and access to data, you're following the letter of the law. Of course, all you have to do is implement all the controls to support it, but we're going to dive into that a little bit as well. And there's a lot of cyber risks that we face on a regular basis. So I selected a few that might be worthwhile the conversation today and map it down to the article in question that would relate the cyber risk to the actual article under GDPR. And then at the end, I would like to give you a few best practice implementation takeaways, some of the things that will let your thought process going. And if you're already started in your program, maybe it'll shed some light on things you should be considering and so on. And towards the end, I will be opening it up for questions. So going to the first slide, why enact the GDPR? We all know or have heard about the Data Protection Directive. It's been around. It had multiple versions. It's been around for about 20 years. Okay, Data Protection Directive set minimum standards for data protection. It provided the controls necessary to identify who, what, when accesses sensitive data, and left it at that. Over time, it became confusing or difficult for European citizens to know how their data is protected. At the same time, organizations found it difficult to determine what laws to comply with. For those of us in the U.S., we have laws bombarding us left and right, from regulatory to standard bodies and the like. It's also a difficult situation for us in the U.S. But as it relates to the European, they're in the same boat. And there's a good tone out of GDPR, which can alleviate a lot of this difficulty for a lot of organizations handling sensitive information. So what did that do? That caused the European Commission to issue a unified law that, one, protects the rights and privacy of European citizens, reduces barriers to business by facilitating data movement. Believe it or not, after many organizations go through the preparation and making sure that the privacy controls and security controls that support them are in place, the quality, the accuracy, to know where your data is going to be very clear compared to previous days. So there is a benefit going forward rather than concern of, oops, I'm going to have regulators knocking on my door. And of course, GDPR supersedes all laws passed by member states prior to its issuance. So let's take a look at GDPR. One thing I'd like to say, if you want to avoid complying with GDPR, I suggest you stop doing business with the European completely, which many organizations can't do that, especially in today's world. GDPR specific requirement that controllers should take into account the nature, scope, and context. I'm reading this for a reason, okay? To show you the complexity of how the information is portrayed and how to extract some plain English out of that. Basically, context and purpose of processing, as well as the risk of varying likelihood for the rights of natural persons, blah, 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 implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure and be able to demonstrate compliance. For the life I've lived, and having to see those statements, the number one thing, and especially with a name like mine, Fouad Khalil, I like the plain English version of everything. So all they're saying, from my understanding, is that organizations must put in place privacy compliance framework that ensures data processing is in compliance with GDPR. It's all about the data. Where is it? Who accesses it? Who has the right to it? Do you have consent to use it? Do you have the right to transport it from one territory to the next? Follow the data, know where your data is, implement controls around it. You will keep auditors happy. And if some organizations already have, and many are for sure, have a compliance framework in place, such as the ISO 27000 or BS standard of 2012, 2017, they're all different flavors of a compliance framework having to focus on privacy. You'll be in good shape. So if you look at GDPR, the fines, you hear all kinds of numbers, and you've heard the 4% of annual worldwide turnover, or 20 million, whichever is higher. If you look at the mid-range of a risk or a potential breach or issue, it looks like I've seen numbers in the 2% or 10 million euros, whichever is higher. In any way you look at it, with all these hefty, scary fines, just to have your name publicly announced as a company experienced a breach due to lack and oversight over controls, that's poor business, and I don't think we would be concerned about the 4%. It will be a lot worse for us. So you look at the global impact. Of course, it's not just European-specific regulation. Every European citizen, and I've used the term resident, by the way, because you don't have to be a citizen to be protected by GDPR. Your feet have to be on the ground in Europe to be protected by this privacy law. So anywhere the business is done with your data across the globe, you are in scope of GDPR. Now, the deadline is looming, May 25th of 2018. The majority of the companies still have a lot of work left to achieve compliance. And there's a slide towards the latter part of this presentation that highlights some of the things that we know right before we talk about best practices. So if you look at financial costs of noncompliance, the regulatory fines are the biggest that comes to mind. Potential lawsuits and what's involved to get those going. Infrastructure repair and design based on findings and lack of controls or security controls or implementations that are necessary to protect sensitive information. Public relations deflection of negative comments. That would be the hardest job of all, in my opinion. And then, of course, hiring compliance contractors to process data on your behalf. If you can't do the job safely within the control of the regulation, bring in some experts that can do that on your behalf. And so on and so on. And you can see there's a lot more that organizations will be worried about if it comes to the point of non-compliance with GDPR. So GDPR principles are straightforward. And the reason I listed them up here, it's really simple in terms of what they're asking organizations to do. And of course, there's a lot of detail behind the scenes that needs to be in place. But like I said before, security programs in place, privacy programs in place are putting you more than halfway through. So we look at the principles. It's lawful, fair, and transparent use of personal data. Again, it's all about the data. And in many of my presentations for the past 2 or 3 years, my focus has been about protecting data. Because in my opinion, if there's nothing important to protect, why would you put controls around it? And then you look at data collection restricted to specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes. There's no using the data because I choose to. There's no use of data because the business unit feels it's necessary for our marketing purposes, whatever. There has to be a legitimate purpose for use of that data. As well as consent. Consent is huge. There must be consent for use of that data from the individual in question. And then, of course, looking at minimum data retention, limited to business purpose requirements. I am very happy to see that CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability was referenced across the board. So data security, confidentiality, integrity is a key component and principle of GDPR. And data controller's responsibility for compliance. You own the data. You go down the supply chain, the vendor chain, the third party, and the like. That data is still your responsibility. You're accountable for it, and the controls must be in place to protect it. So if we look at the goals of GDPR, you need to define privacy policies. Take all that's stated, make sure that it's documented, communicated, and everybody is trained and made aware of it. Protect personal data from breaches, which is everybody's job in the same field that we're in. Establish consistent level of data protection across Europe. So you can't have one set of controls in one location that varies from another. It has to be consistent. One important goal is to improve the trust between citizens and businesses. With all the different breaches and the large breaches we've heard and the number of breaches we're hearing about, the trust is lacking. The more implementation of such regulations and privacy and security controls, the better the trust, in my opinion, would be between us and the businesses that handle our data. Another excellent goal is increase organizational accountability for data practices. Like I said before, your data is yours. You're accountable no matter where the data is housed. And restrict use of personal data. We do not have to use personal data for everything we do in our business. Let's use what we need for the business purpose specified for it and move on. And then restore control of personal information to individuals. Just the fact that you need consent before using the data is huge win for individuals, as well as the fact that individuals have the right to reach out to an organization and say, you know what, I would like you to not transport my data anywhere out of the territory I live in. Or they may come back and say, I would like you to erase, make sure that I am forgotten from today and prior. And that could pose a lot of technical challenges to a lot of organizations. But again, it puts the individual at a control of their data, which you and I, we all respect that. So from a high-level requirements of GDPR, for the sake of time, we can't dive into details, but at least this will drive enough thought and trigger some questions. GDPR requires clear, specific, freely given, and withdrawable consent for use of personal information. I highlighted that a little bit earlier, but consent is huge. I can give it today, I can take it away tomorrow. Adequate mitigation in place to minimize risk of data breaches. It's all a risk-based approach. It's critical to keep that in mind. The less of a risk being none or negligible, and you may have a potential of a compromise or data breach, believe it or not, you're in better shape than having a higher risk scenario around the data in question. Full transparency regarding how, when, and where personal data is used or shared, and disposal of personal data upon request or withdrawal of consent to process. So yes, it is a tidal wave hitting the European Union and global organizations, but in all said and done, it's critical. And I think looking down the line and the time frame that we have and the controls that will be in place year after year and the better visibility we have into the personal data, I think we're going to be in a much better place. Yes, I am a proponent of GDPR, but as we all know, nothing of that comes without a price and preparation, implementation, awareness, and the like, and I'm going to highlight that a little bit. So if you look at GDPR, it's broken up into multiple principles. And the first chapter has Articles 1 through 4, talks about general provisions. Then it dives into the principles of it, which Articles 5 through 10 talks about the lawfulness, consent, child consent, and so on. The rights of data subject, Articles 12 through 23, transparency, access, recertification, the right to be forgotten. This is erasure, restricting the access rights, and so on. We talked about data portability. Chapter 4 contains Articles 24 through 43, which have to do with the controller and processor. Definitions, responsibilities, data protection and privacy by design, which is critical. I am a proponent of continuous compliance, which can only, in my opinion, be accomplished by implementing privacy and security by design and by default. Once your security control implementations are part of your business as usual processes, the better in shape you are in compliance with those set controls. And then takes it further to security breaches, DPIA, which is Data Protection Impact Assessment. This is critical. The law talks about data protection impact assessment and does require that to take place every set period of time, at least annually. And that basically follows through all the personal data in question and makes sure that all the risks are assessed around that data and to ensure that the risk is minimal and the necessary controls are in place to protect them. Now, one thing I'd like to highlight, GDPR doesn't require you to do data mapping. I highly recommend you do a data mapping before you even start your data protection impact assessment, simply because you can't protect what it. So data mapping will allow you to identify all the data elements in question and identify the location, the state they're being used, what application they're being used, where they're housed, where they're archived, and that will give you the flow to follow through with the data protection impact assessment. Chapter 5 has Articles 44 to 50, talks about transfer of personal data to third countries or international organizations. 4 more chapters real quick, having to do Chapter 6, having to do independent supervisory authority, which is the government-appointed authorities to come in and do audits and best practice review and recommendations. Chapter 7 with Articles 60 through 76, cooperation and consistency, one-stop shop, mutual assistance and joint operations. Chapter 8, remedies, liabilities, and penalties, talks about the process for issuing complaints, judicial remedies, and so on. And last but not least, provisions relating to specific processing situations. So processing versus freedom of information, processing versus public access to official documents, and so on. One thing to highlight that the chapters 3 through 5 are the main body of the narrative content that cause significant effort for organizations. And if I go back one slide, again, 3 through 5, having to do with the rights of the data subjects, the controller and processor accountability responsibility, and then the transfer of the personal data of third-party countries and international organizations. That will require a lot of work on organizations' behalf. Okay, it is now time for our first polling question. The first polling question having to do with what constitutes personal data under GDPR. And hopefully you're all having some options to select from. And I'll wait till all the data comes through. Okay. Excellent. So looking at that data, it actually, I'm happy to see that we're all on the same page. the majority, over 74, 75%, identified the fact that all the above constitute personal data under GDPR. I know I didn't put such a tricky question, and I would ask Lucy to publish the result for the audience to see, if you could. Great. So you're all seeing the same data I am seeing. And then 83% of you, 854, said E, all the above. Thank you for that number being that high. I'm happy to see that. Because a lot of questions having to go about personal data under GDPR, if you're familiar with the various state breach legislations in the U.S., and it talks about PII, credit card data, and so on, and protected health information and the like, in my opinion, GDPR takes that and puts it on steroids and adds online identifiers, your IP address and your cookie information, and all the above. And it's critical to note that because on the next slide, I'm going to show you what their definition is from GDPR on personal data. It means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, somebody residing in the EU, known as the data subject. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, identification number, location, data, online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, and so on. Okay, I had to stop. But I put that for a reason. When you read a statement like that from Article 4, Section 1, you know you cannot really scope out anything when it comes to GDPR. Okay? Article 17, 20, and 24 present three examples of why inventorying personal data is a good first step to understanding ramifications of GDPR. Okay? It's critical to understand the scope of your data by conducting your data mapping and exercising your data protection impact assessment, because the story is real. As of yesterday, the number I've seen in terms of data records lost or stolen since 2013 is in the 9+ billion. Yes, that is billions. So there are definitely justifications and reasons behind enacting such a regulation. This slide, I'm not going to go through to detail, but I love it simply because it highlights to you where you are the data subject. And any information pertaining to your basic information, from belief, thoughts, credentials, preferences, to historical information, to your financial information, we're all very familiar with, your social information, your real-time data, from device tracking to contact information, location-based, such as geotagging, and so on, even behavioral or usage patterns, which, by the way, a lot of information we leverage online. There's a lot of marketing organizations that live and breathe this type of data. So they're going to have a hard time making sure that they get the right consent for the right data for the right time to be able to continue to use that for marketing purposes. And then added information such as ethnicity, behavioral patterns, and so on. So if you look at this big picture here, my advice to you is, when in doubt, protect. All data is in scope of GDPR. Organizations are restricted when it comes to de-identifying or scoping out data, okay? There's a lot of effort under different regulations where it's easier to scope out systems and applications because they do not house the necessary data for that law to be applicable. In my opinion, under GDPR, that would be close to impossible to do. I recommend that you treat everything as protected data. Continuing on, so it's all a risk-based approach, which is really the nature of how we have been the trend in security and privacy in the past few years. It's all about risk. Article 32, the degree of effort invested in a particular measure must be informed by the risk present in a particular setting or application, okay? In other words, when you do your data protection impact assessment and you identify all the risks to all the processes that handle data and where they reside, or what state they're in, and where they're archived, and so on, when you have negligent to minor risk to data, you're in good shape. Whenever you get to the medium and the highs, you need to take action and see what controls are necessary to mitigate, to minimize that risk to unauthorized access to personal data. Prioritize your approach to compliance by cyber risk factors based on your organization's setup. There are a lot of ways, a lot of things you need to do to ensure compliance with GDPR, but I would like today to highlight in the next few slides where do cyber risks come in and how do they potentially impact my compliance with GDPR. So let's take a look. This next slide, it's actually a public report we put out, and it's available everywhere by my organization, but I'm putting it out there for an excellent reason. One is to highlight some of the most trendy top 10 threat indicators organizations face. And things range. When you put your hacker hat on right now and look at your website and look at all your partner websites and look at all the suppliers and look at all the data that gets transitioned between all, where are the potential holes? So you need to make sure that you have applicable network security controls, your DNS is healthy and ready, your patching is on time, your endpoint security, and so on, all the way through hacker chatter, information leak, and social engineering. And this is just one way of looking at information and to consider what protection you need for that purpose. Okay, let's take a look at the first slide that have to do with cyber risk. I'd like to address patching. Patching has always been an issue ever since I started my career under the compliance and security realm. It's always been a pain point to bring up patch management, and where are we? Staying on top of patching is critical. Patching your operating system, your services, your applications, your software, your hardware, and I could roll on and on forever, is critical. A measure of organizational health that is an indicator of cybersecurity processes and procedures when you look at patching. You need to focus on prioritization of issue by risk. Again, it's all risk-based. So whatever you do in your patch lifecycle, and you identify the high risk that could potentially have a risk of data compromise, that needs to be addressed immediately. Patching also emphasizes on ongoing monitoring and remediation. That is all part of the GDPR lingo. And it enables compliance with Articles 24, 25, and I'm going to list a few because a table is provided. And if you Google General Data Protection Regulation verbiage, you're going to find the official site for it. You can dig deeper and get all the articles and all the details. But at least this gives you a perspective that if you're not up to speed on your patching level, you are opening the door for potential compromise in more ways than one, because it opens the door to your critical assets such as operating systems and applications and other software and hardware components. The comment on the right there I made is that many vulnerabilities exploited by hackers are vulnerabilities already addressed by released patches. See, that would be a situation I do not wish to be in if my organization gets hacked due to a patch that was already announced and a fix for it is out there and all I needed to do is apply it, but I was a little bit behind the bad guys. Now let's take a look at endpoint security. What's endpoint? Endpoint is your laptop, it's your desktop, it's your mobile device. It's really any and all employee devices accessing company network. Security around those endpoints is critical because, again, it's a gateway into the information that houses protected data that needs to comply with GDPR. So proper endpoint security helps organizations secure against data leakage, malware, and theft. By 2019, 30% of organizations will face significant financial exposure from regulatory bodies due to their failure to comply with GDPR requirements. That is a huge number, and that's just a year away. I mean, I listed quite a few GDPR articles that would fall under this realm or have a reference that would have to do with endpoint security, but we all know that any access point from any device coming into my company network where all my data is housed must be protected. Next one, I combined the social engineering and leak credentials. Social engineering is huge, it's well known, it's been going on forever. And it's a virtual or physical social engineering attack. You have employees that are using corporate accounts, and they use it for different services, or they may use it for social networking, or sometimes they may use it for personal finance, and so on and so on. These are all ways that could be exploited and used by hackers, activists, and the like to access information that's not authorized to be accessed by them. And of course, leaked credentials is a dead giveaway. Once your credentials are leaked, you're opening the door for ease of access. Phishing activity rose from 2015 to 2016 to a total of 1.2 million attacks, 65% increase year over year. That is huge. Want to cry ransomware? One example from 2017 how social engineering can pose a massive risk to organizations worldwide. And you can see what doors that opens to lack of compliance, opens the door to lack of security controls and the like, and eventually the potential or actual compromise of data. Now, of course, cyber risk is incomplete without the mention of network security. Security hacks, exploiting vulnerabilities such as open access points or misconfigured SSL, is a well-known fact. Network security controls are critical. Network is a huge aspect of your perimeter. Understand the security setup and scope of network security weaknesses is key. Using a tool or tools that can scan for vulnerabilities periodically and can record remediation efforts, that is key. I mean, what do auditors do? When they come in and say, hey, organization A, you had a weakness and potential compromise to data due to a network security flaw. What have you done in the last 6 months to make sure that there's sufficient controls around network security and that is information is continuously monitored and remediated? They're looking for evidence. They trust what you say, but they want to verify. They're going to look at log files. They're going to look at all the high risks identified prior, and they want to see what you've done to mitigate those risks. One word that most organizations in the audit world don't like to hear is willful neglect. The fact that you have a potential of evidence of knowing of a vulnerability or exposure and not taking the action timely, which caused a breach, that equates to a willful neglect, and that could open the door for fines and trouble and the like. So stay on top of it. From a third-party perspective, these steps help evaluate whether the organizations you are dealing with implement minimum controls like firewalls. So if I'm a hospital and I'm working with all kinds of vendors to process protected health information, not only my information needs to have solid network security controls, they must as well. In my opinion, if you can't keep up as a partner of mine with the security controls, privacy controls required to comply with Gdpr, you and I are going to have a hard time doing business together. So, of course, all this, having the right network security at the right place, simply assist you in enabling compliance with various articles across the board. Okay, I like to bring up Hacker Chatter. This is one of my favorites. Not everybody has access to the dark web. The underground chatter in very hard to access private forums and the like. This information is critical simply because if your company name or your C-level executive name comes up, or anything related to your business comes up in Hacker Chatter, that means somebody is talking about you, somebody is suggesting ideas, somebody is proposing a topic or indicating a potential access point, you name it. Having visibility into what the hacker world is up to is critical to make sure that you are ready for the unexpected. Not everything is black and white, unfortunately, and not everything is easy to be proactive and find out, but we are trying to cover the realm of cyber risk to have a big picture to mitigate as much risk as possible to personal data. It's not a perfect world, but we cannot leave any stones unturned in our effort to comply with GDPR. Even though we know that mentions in the dark web don't always mean an attack, but it may be definitely an indicator of a potential risk. And then looking at cyber risk having to do with application security. I mean, a lot of applications, their sole purpose is to handle data and provide service and exchange data with the end user, with third parties, and things like that. There's all kinds of application security concerns that come up, and we hear all about cross-site scripting issues, and we hear about SQL injections, just different ways that opens the door for hackers to access data from an unauthorized, unacceptable fashion. GDPR requirements focus on securing the flow of data through applications. So this is key. It's a huge requirement, and locking down your application security is critical. So you need to assess, prevent, and monitor to ensure success with application security. As you're going to hear the term protect by design and by default, security by design and security by default, means that as you design your application or as you implement changes, security has to be part of the whole process. Just like I mentioned earlier, continuous compliance means you include your security controls in everything you do from a day to day in, day out with your daily procedures. Same thing has to apply when you're designing your applications, when you're publishing your applications, when you're putting new functions and features or reports. Security is part of the formula. That ensures that your application is hardened, your application is secure, It follows a best practice methodology and minimizes the risks of application security flaws that typically open the door to hackers. And you can notice the list of referenced articles to this cyber risk extends a little bit. So to summarize them again, just to show the risk that I rattled off from patching. So you look at the patching cadence and the various articles. Regular assessments and ongoing monitoring is vital. Endpoint security, threats extend to the IoT landscape. And just the IoT alone is becoming a huge risk that needs to be better managed, better controlled across the globe. Social engineering, leaked credentials, controlling the human element can help mitigate the risk. And network security, perimeter controls, and other network security measures should be implemented. Hacker chatter can indicate increased risk in some cases. And in some cases, it may indicate nothing. But it's worthwhile to investigate and find out what can be done to, again, prevent loss, mitigate risk. And application security, unpatched and unhardened applications may lead to data compromise. So I'm hoping at this point, as you saw prior, that the GDPR is enacted. Its intent is to provide control to the data subjects. It's designed to protect all personal information, which I highlighted. It's everything you can think of. It's designed to ensure that there's consent to process, to handle, to store that data. It's designed to make sure that you protect it from all aspects. So just the cyber risk perspective, a moment ago I asked you to put on your cyber hacker hat on, looking from the outside in, there's a lot of loopholes that need to be addressed. And this is only the beginning to start to ensure that you have sufficient controls to protect against unauthorized access to personal data. At the same token, conduct your high demand, high resource intensive business as usual day-to-day procedures. Okay, now it's time for our second polling question. And I'm sure all the numbers are coming in now. By the way, I love polling questions. I just love to see how things start going up the scale. And I'm always excited and happy to see that some things are going up in the direction I would like to see or the best practice entails. And again, I didn't put any tricks around this. I just wanted to deliver a message, which is coming in the next slide. All right. I think the popcorn stopped popping, and why don't we publish this, please? So if you look at it, the majority, again, picked all the above. If you look at the question and how I asked that question is, what is the most critical step of a GDPR program implementation? I highlighted personal data management. And I'm like, how can I abbreviate this monster in a simple 5-section question? But personal data management, data subjects consent, etc. Should we start off with risk management, DPIA? Apologies, but C is wrapped around with option B. But personal data breaches, incident management and reporting, management commitment and awareness and training, or all the above. And thank you all for the majority saying it's all the above. It is all the above. It is critical to address all of those things that I mentioned as you start tackling on your GDPR compliance program. So some of the things we know so far. Let me point to you the right side of this slide. As of noon today, when we started this call, the day for GDPR to take effect is 93 days, 7 hours, and 0 minutes away. That's from noon today. That's not long at all. It's 93 days and 7 hours. So if you've taken some action and you're already ahead of the game, kudos, job well done. If not, I highly recommend that you do not delay one more day. Because I'll tell you one thing, I used to do a lot of audits myself. And if I go to an organization and say, you knew this was coming, tell me where you are. And they may not be compliant across the board, but guess what? They came back to me and showed me a progress plan with somebody's name attached to each of those efforts, showing progress step by step towards compliance. Even though they have not reached the compliance threshold they need to be at, but believe it or not, that is acceptable remediation, that is acceptable evidence, and the impact of lack of compliance is a lot less than not having progress plans in place. So some of the data I'd like to share with you today, 73% of data privacy professionals believe GDPR is the most important change in the past 20 years. Again, some people may argue one way or the other, but I do agree it's going to make the data crystal clear. It's going to make the controls around it crystal clear. It's going to put the data subjects, the you and I, in charge, and I think it's only in the right direction. 82% of privacy professionals believe GDPR will have a positive impact on consumer data protection. Of course, data quality improves, data mobility improves, knowing where my data is and be able to say, forget my data. I mean, it's just the trust is going to be there. GDPR applies to all businesses that collect or process European citizens. And regardless of geographical location. I'm going to start changing the word citizens to residents. Again, anybody residing in the European Union is protected by GDPR. 92% of businesses have started preparing for GDPR. That's a PwC survey. 77% of businesses have started preparing for GDPR as well. I apologize, looks like we did a double here. 68% of U.S. business plans to spend $1 to $10 million on GDPR preparation. And I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the role of a data protection officer. This is an individual that is hired that owns the data protection impact assessment, that owns the training and awareness, that owns the communication to all employees and management and the board. That individual is the interface between the organization and the supervisor authority. And that person has a signed get out of jail free card because if they report issues about the organization they work at, they cannot be fired. So they're protected, and their role, if you look at the job description for the data protection officer, they're very hard to find, but they are critical. And then it is estimated they will have 28,000 positions that need to be filled by May of this year. That is 28,000, incredible large number. Okay, some of the takeaways. I have a couple slides about takeaways, and we're going to take it to questions, okay? And I see a lot of questions are coming up, and I'm going to try and address as many as I can before the call is over. Manage your program, your GDPR program, as an enterprise-wide process movement initiative, okay? That's all it is. You're introducing a new way of doing business. You're introducing a new way of protecting data. You're introducing a new way of communicating information. You're producing a new way of handling data and transporting data and deleting data, and so on and so on. To me, that sounds like a straightforward process movement initiative. That's a great way to start your thoughts around GDPR implementation. Identify and classify personal data. Enterprise-wide data mapping is critical. I can't emphasize that point enough, but please, inventory, identify, classify, and know where all your data is before you even start your data protection impact assessment. Know where it is before you assess the risk around it. Manage and continuously evaluate your risk. That's the DPIA. It's all risk-based approach. So you have to show evidence on an ongoing risk assessment processes for ensuring that controls are sufficient to protect personal data of data subjects. Governance is huge. Every organization has a governance entity of one kind or another, but now you need to include your data protection officer. You need to make sure that the consents are managed and housed and tracked. You need to make sure that your policies and procedures reflect what GDPR is asking of your organizations to do, and make sure that all the processing of all the data is registered and identified. Again, it goes back to data mapping. The data mapping is going to highlight a lot of these things. You can add to your data mapping effort which one of these do we actually have consent for and which ones we do not. So you can lay out that structure to show all the gaps necessary to fill in before May comes around. And of course, internal controls is one of my favorite. Having internal controls support GDPR and all other frameworks and regulations we're concerned about, but implementing them will support your GDPR requirements. Map your internal controls to the articles in compliance in the GDPR. Make sure that they're reviewed, tested, and independently audited. If you're in a financial institution and you heard the word SOX 404, everybody loses their mind because auditors are coming. We got to show evidence and test on a regular basis. The same thing applies here. To continue with the last 4 items of takeaways, data security is critical as GDPR specifically addresses the CIA and requires a risk-based approach to security and risk mitigation. It's great. Taking a risk-based approach is excellent, and following that process is how they will evaluate if you were, God forbid, to have a breach of information, how they would evaluate and look at your information and take a look at your risk mitigation approach to protecting that information. That's critical. Manage your GDPR compliance through the supply chain. Where is your data? Where are the boundaries? Who's handling it on your behalf? And the way you manage your partners and third party and your suppliers must remain, if not more, cumbersome and more diligent under GDPR. But again, the controller owns the data, accountable for the data. A breach is to occur. They're accountable to make sure that all the steps are necessary to mitigate and eliminate the risk. And then clearly define your breach notification process to supervisor authorities and data subjects. I mean, you heard it's once you're aware of a breach, you got 72 hours to let the supervisor authority know. The good thing is you only have to notify the supervisor authority for your territory. So if I'm a company in Europe and I have locations across Europe and Germany and different locations and stuff like that, and I have a breach, I only have to work with one supervisor authority of that location where the breach occurred. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good thing to go through that, but at least you don't have multiple supervisor authorities knocking on your door. And then, as with any new processes, procedures, campaigns, make sure that all the organization is well informed. Make sure that your awareness program through company-wide initiatives from the top down. There's no excuses. Everybody has to see the importance of handling the data. They have to see the importance of GDPR. And from my experience, I used to go to different IT groups, for example, and let them know why I need those controls in place. It was a tough battle. Once I changed that lingo and I explained to them, what is the ramifications for not hardening passwords on servers? What does that mean in terms of noncompliance and other scenarios? What are the ramifications for not having sufficient physical safeguards, like biometrics, to access the data center? Explain it in terms of, in my world, plain English, and show exactly by not implementing the control, it means you can have ramifications 1 through 10. You can have cost implications 1 through 10. And it could cost us a stock price drop. It can cost a company reputation drop. It can cost jobs. When you put it in that perspective, everybody's buy-in comes into play. And with that said, I will hand it back over to Lucy. Let me look at some of the questions I have here. There's an interesting question here. What if there is a conflict between the U.S. law requiring storage of personal information versus GDPR requiring elimination of it? Well, this is where you're going to slice and dice. You need to identify where the data of the European residents is housed versus non-European residents. Your data mapping should identify all that. So once you go through that and know where your data is, and it applies to European residents, and you know for a fact it's under the scope of GDPR, then you need to follow that rule. And if you're able to separate that from other nations, the U.S. and the like, that do not directly get impacted by GDPR, you should be able to easily split the responsibility there. Okay, one question is, am I accountable for all vendors and third parties? Wow, questions are coming up real fast. Am I accountable for all vendors and third parties that have my data? If not, should we add into contracts that they are responsible? Should we mention to the vendor third party that they need to be compliant? What is the best way to deal with vendor parties that have our data? If I was hired at your organization and you told me to take care of our vendors, they're going to follow the same letter of the law that I will. Okay? There's no ifs and buts about applying necessary controls and privacy statements and consent for use of data and the like I would. They're accountable as I am. And yes, you can leverage contracts to ensure that the relationship is clear and the ramifications are clear. But I would tell you, the accountability falls on you first. But if you had your due diligence and you had your contracts in place and you communicated what controls are needed to ensure that the data is protected, you're in a much better shape than not. And then you can transition the issue down to your third party if there was a breach or data compromise. Somebody asked, can you give an example of an online identifier for personal information? And I'm going to scroll back and show that one slide. If you look at social information, for example, there's online identifier having to do with your social information, as well as the information having to do with your real-time data, your device-dependent tracking, your IP address, your cookie information, your geotagging information, your behavioral patterns online, and so on. I'm hoping that helps answer that question. I'm so happy with all these questions. I wish I had the time to answer them all, but I'm going to go through as many as I can before the time runs up. Is there a formula for non-compliance fines? That is an excellent question. Here's how I've addressed this question. You need to look at the scenario if there was a breach. Okay? There's a lot of published articles and questionnaires out there that drive you through how to assess the risk under GDPR, even though I haven't taken effect, if I were to have a breach. One, have I done what I'm supposed to do under GDPR? Example, data mapping, data protection impact assessment, DPO, policies and procedures, communication, training, blah, 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 all the above. Check. Have I done the data mapping that I know exactly what data, what state it's in, how is it being processed, and how that process is registered for the data that was breached? Two, how much of that data is lost? Do I have that number? Three, was I successful in implementing controls to mitigate the risk to that data before the breach occurred? But unfortunately, life is not perfect, and the world is not perfect. There's still a chance for vulnerability, and it slipped through the cracks. If you look at all those questions and you ask yourself, have I done all these things? If you said yes to all of them, I can guarantee you that the impact and your relationship with the supervisory authority will be a lot more pleasant than not. And those are the types of things, just to scratch the surface, that will drive how much of a fine you're going to get. Are you in the high level or in the medium level? Or are you going to get away by simply having to implement some controls and redo some of the, redesign and re-engineer some of the applications? So there's no one set answer to make that clear. But again, put on your risk assessment hat, and figure out for that breach, did I have all my ducks in a row or not? And if the answer is yes to most, then you're in good shape. Okay, I'll go and answer one more, and I'll hand it back to Lucy. How are companies going to deal with backups, including historical backups? Again, data mapping is key. The way I used to present a lot about security around protecting data, irrelevant of what regulation you have in place. But when you look at different data elements, live the life of the data. Take it from the point it's created up to the point it's destroyed. That means that data went from entry to storage to uses to processing to you name it, all the way through archiving, backup, and finally destruction. Following that path, following that data across all those states is in scope of your GDPR. So once you identify where that data is, even if it's archived and backed up, you need to make sure that you have necessary controls for one, protect it. Two, do you have the consent of the data subject to store it or archive it? Three, what if I came to you and said, delete it? You need to have knowledge of it and be able to go back to the specific archive and whack it. All right, I think we are at a good point here to pass it back on to my good friend Lucy.
Hi, Fouad. If you'd like, we can take a few more questions. We have time. I know that we are, everyone has a lot of questions on this. So if you'd like, we can take a few more.
I would be more than happy to. I had, for some reason, 5 minutes of the hour to stop, but I will be happy to continue that. Okay. Looking at a question here, what if your company is based in the U.S. and it scrolled up again? I apologize. What if you're So many questions are coming in, and it keeps rolling up every time I get one. I lost that question. Okay. Who can be appointed as data protection officer? Any specific educational qualification required? Okay, the way we address that is, if you look at the actual general data protection regulation documentation, you're going to see specifically what they're asking the data protection officer job requirement to be. And I'll be honest with you, if you're able to find somebody with those skills, I'm going to salute you. It's close to impossible. That individual will have legal background, regulatory background, privacy background, security background, negotiation background, training background. So you can imagine, oh my God, we're going to find a person like that. If you were to find somebody and willing to take the job, put them in that role, it's a win-win. For different size organizations, it might not be as feasible to just assign that role to one individual. You may have different individuals wear that hat, or you may have a function of, or a group of individuals that will play the data protection officer role. So it all depends. The bottom line is that group, that individual, or somebody playing that role should be able to address the data protection impact assessment, own that process, should know where all the data is, should make sure that the training is conducted thoroughly and across all and everyone at the organization, and be ready to have the conversation and show evidence to the supervisory authorities when they come knocking. I know it's a long-winded answer, but there are many ways to do that. So it is up to you on the size of your organization and how you deploy it. Everybody would love to have one person, one name, with all the skills to take on that job, but it's not going to be as easy as everybody thinks. And plus, if you looked at one of the stats I had earlier, it is expected that we're going to hire 28,000 DPOs, or at least have that role formed by May. So we got some challenges ahead of us. Okay, I will take one more. This is an excellent question that I don't have a full answer for, but it talks about how monitoring of compliance will be performed after May. You know, from what I've seen from different legislations in the U.S. and regulations and laws, they've issued all kinds of guidance that helps us go through the process of knowing what to expect if an audit or something happens. I have not seen that pop up officially yet for the GDPR deployment. Keep your eyes open, subscribe to different news that gives you all the feeds necessary, but I'm sure and I'm hoping that there will be some guidance issued that will show what supervisory authorities will go through, what they would ask, what they would walk through, and what evidence they will acquire if they were to come in an audit and ask questions for your organization. And hopefully it's just an exercise of compliance and audit, not necessarily an exercise for a breach, but I would imagine the two would be very similar processes. Okay, Lucy, I will send it back to you. We are almost at 12:59 p.m.
Thank you so much, Fouad. I really appreciate that. With that, it looks like we're just about out of time for today. So I'd like to thank Fouad for that great presentation and interesting Q&A session. Thank you for taking those couple extra questions as well. Also, a big thank you to our sponsor, our Security Scorecard, whose support has made it possible for ISACA to offer this event free of charge to our constituents. Don't forget to check out the tabs at the top of your screen to view the additional resource, as well as download a PDF of today's presentation deck. This webinar was recorded, so you can go back and watch it from the on-demand program section in your classroom within the My Learning portal. Again, I'd like to thank Fouad for his time and energy today, along with everyone in our live audience for your attention and participation. Have a great rest of your day.